Hey, all, today we're going to continue talking about congruent triangles and those shortcuts we use to show that triangles are congruent. But today we're going to kind of add an extra layer, and that is to formally write what is called a proof that two triangles are congruent. So we have been looking at two triangles and marking things up, and we have been deciding which of the 5 shortcuts we can use to say they're congruent. But sometimes we want to do that formally, to really prove why and lay out why we can say the triangles are congruent. And so what we're going to do is write 2-column proofs. They're called 2-column proofs because there are 2 columns. There's the first column, which is statements, and the second column, which are reasons. Statements are things that we are claiming are true. These are our claims. Our reasons, those are the um, geometric facts, or yeah, facts, that's probably good enough. Those are the geometric facts that prove or show that our statements are valid. And so in these ones we have kind of like a little bank to choose from. And we have put in the exact number of steps that we're going to have to take to show that the two triangles are congruent. And much like all of this stuff, this is very new. And so it's going to take some practice and some time to get really comfortable with. We're always given some information, and we're asked to prove something. So we're asked to prove these two triangles are congruent given this information. And this is similar to when we're given a picture and there's some stuff marked on it. So what I'm going to do is mark the stuff that we know. This says that PQ is congruent to ST. So on PQ and ST, I'm going to go put 1 mark. And I've used that. And then it says QR is congruent to TR. QR is congruent to TR. And then it says that R is the midpoint of PS. So R is the midpoint of PS, this whole long segment. So we have to understand what it means to be a midpoint here. A midpoint is in the exact middle. And so that if you are on a journey and you are at the midpoint of your journey, that means that you are in the exact middle of your journey. That means the part that you've already completed is the same length as the part you need to complete. And so that means that these two segments are also congruent. And so once we have the picture marked up with everything that we know because we are given, and we could also look for things like vertical angles or reflexive property and mark those things up, even if it's not in the list of given statements, because we're always allowed to do that. Once we have this marked up, we can look at this like a problem we've already done. We would decide which shortcut applies here. And again, you could always write the options. We have 5 options, and since we're proving these triangles congruent, um, there's not going to be a not enough information option. We're definitely going to be able to show that they're congruent. So if you look at these two triangles, hopefully you have decided that side, side, side is the best method. And actually, if you look at the options down here, side, side, side is the only option. And so the first statements I'm going to write are statements that are my given pieces of information. So my first statements in any proof is always going to be the stuff I've been given. So we can copy down everything we're given. PQ is congruent to ST. QR is congruent to TR. And then R is the midpoint, and I'm going to abbreviate here, of PS. And you can see all of those options are down here. So PQ is an ST, QR and TR, R is the midpoint of PS. And so now we need to justify why we're allowed to say that. Well, if you look here, we have three options that all say given, and we're allowed to say that these things are true because we were told they are. So of course they're true. And so we would write given. And so this given information gave us those pieces that we marked up. This piece of information, R is the midpoint of PS, allowed us to then put on our picture those markings. And so this piece of information told us those markings existed, so now we need to write something about what we have here because of these markings. PR is congruent to SR. Oops. The reason we're allowed to say that is not because it was given to us. We're allowed to say that because we use this information about a midpoint to tell us that those two pieces must be equal. Since R was the midpoint, those two segments must be equal. And so you can see down here, we have this option, definition of midpoint. By definition, since R is the midpoint, these two segments must be congruent. And so in here, for our reason for saying they're congruent, it's because, hey, that's the definition of a midpoint. A midpoint makes two segments that are congruent. Once we have put in our proof all of the things we marked up, and we've decided that the way we're going to prove these two things are congruent is by side, side, side. Once we've written all the information that shows us that we have side, 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 we can now conclude that our triangles are congruent. Triangle PQR, and again, that's down here, is congruent to triangle STR. Our reason is the side, side, side shortcut, so you can just write SSS. And so our first statements are always going to be our given information. Our last statement is always going to be the thing we want to prove. And then once we have proved it, we can move on. So let me do another one. We can mark these things up. In both of these given pieces of information, we're told that X is a midpoint. So X is the midpoint of VZ, and what that means is that VX and XZ will be congruent to each other. They'll be the same length. X is also the midpoint of WY, and so that means since it's right in the middle, WX and XY are congruent. And then the last thing we know about these two pictures is that we have vertical angles. And so they're congruent. Even though it's not part of the given information, we can write that down, or we can mark those up because vertical angles will always be congruent. And so I'm going to start my proof off by putting my first two statements here, and my reason for that is that they are given. So I just put my two pieces of given information in there, and my justification is that they were given. And so now I want to write in my proof, well, that given information allowed us to mark some things up. So what is it that we marked up? So I want to say something about Vx and Xz, and we have that down here. I'm going to say that Vx is congruent to Xz. And we knew that because X was the midpoint, so we can say definition of midpoint. And then because X was the midpoint of WY, we also knew that WX and XY were congruent. And for the same reason, definition of midpoint. Because or when something is a midpoint, the two segments it's in the middle of are congruent. The last thing we need to say is that these two angles are congruent. And you can use the bank down here. WXV, WXV, and YXZ are congruent. The reason they were congruent is because they were vertical angles. And so I realized I didn't do this at the beginning, but we can look here and decide which of our options we have. And you can see down here in our bank, there's only one option. We have side, angle, side, because we have two pairs of congruent sides and the angles in between them that are congruent. We've put the two pairs of sides being congruent onto our proof. We've put the pair of angles being congruent onto our proof. So we've said all the things we need to say about all the markings we've made. And so we can conclude that these two triangles are congruent. The last thing we do is say what it is we're trying to prove. And the reason they're congruent is because of our side angle side shortcut. So let me do one more. I am going to start by writing the statements that I'm given and the reasons that they are given before we start marking anything up. So now that I've written those down, we can mark up the picture with what that means. QR is this segment right here, and this is saying that it bisects this angle PQS. So bisect means to cut in half. And when you cut something in half, both of those halves are equal to each other, or in this case, congruent. So if we're cutting PQS in half, that means that this angle and this angle are congruent to each other. And then we're also told that PRQ and SRQ are congruent to each other. So PRQ is this angle. SRQ is this angle. So they're congruent. And then one other thing we have on this picture that we're not told, but we know is true just by looking at it, is that this side QR is in both triangles, and therefore we have the reflexive property. And so we can mark that they're congruent. And so if you look at this picture, we can choose from our options. And even if you already know what it is, it's not a bad idea to write all the options down. You're just reinforcing what they are. And also, if you could peek down here at the word or the bank, you could see that the only option here is angle side angle. And that is in fact what we have marked up. We have two pairs of angles congruent in these two triangles, and the sides between those angles are congruent. So this is going to be an angle side angle proof. What we need to write down are all the things that we've marked up. So far we have written down that those angles are congruent. We were able to mark these two angles congruent because of this bisecting thing, and so we should write that those angles are congruent on our proof. If you need some help, we have that right there. Angle PQR is congruent to angle SQR. We knew that because of this bisector. It's called an angle bisector because it cuts an angle in half. And we can just write definition of angle bisector. We also were able to say that QR was the same in both of these triangles. And so the way we say that is QR is congruent to QR. We say it's congruent to itself. It was that reflexive property that allowed us to do that. And so we've written down now everything that we've marked up, everything that showed us that angle side angle was the right choice. And so we have enough information to have proven our triangles are congruent. So our last step is to actually say, hey, these triangles are congruent to each other. And our reason is that angle side angle shortcut. So we've already been doing this without all of the statements and reasons. This is a more formal way to show why what you're saying is true. We have now justified why these two triangles are congruent by angle side angle. So I have one of these for you to try. I'm going to pause and fill in some of the statements and reasons, and you should pause and copy down the picture and the information so that you can mark up the picture. So hopefully you've copied this picture down. I want you to, we're going to fill in the blanks here basically. So there'll be a box to pop up for each of these, and I'm going to scroll down. So hopefully you have this picture copied. If you don't, pause and copy it. And I want you to use our statement reason bank down here to answer and fill in the rest of these blanks for this proof. As ever, if you need help, if you're confused at all, please do raise your hand and ask for help. So hopefully you filled in these blanks correctly. If you missed one or more, please do ask for help, and we can help you figure out why the right answer is right. If you feel good about this, you can move on and you can answer the questions based on this proof. So make sure you copy the picture down, the given and the proof, so that when I scroll down, you can use the answer choices to fill in these 5 parts of the proof. Take your time, and if you ever do need help, please make sure that you ask.